Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Kvetching with Adam and Jared. This is episode number, I've lost count at this point, and that's really okay. We have a very special guest tonight, David Bernstein, who's a law professor, and we are going to let him introduce himself after Adam and I do our usual introductions. And our subject for tonight will be Students for Justice in Palestine, and its recent cancellation on campuses, and of course their activities on other campuses. And we're going to get a legal perspective from it, which is really terrific. So I'm Jared Tanney. I hold the Block Chair in Jewish History at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington.
And I'm Adam Fuller, and I am the Clayman Professor of Jewish Studies and Associate Professor of Political Science at Youngstown State University.
Your title changes every week, Adam. You seem to have your title.
Oh, the same.
All right. Our guest.
Yeah, our guest to introduce himself.
Yeah, hi, I'm David Bernstein. I am officially the Distinguished University Professor at Antonin Scalia Law School at George Mason University, but more concisely, I'm a law professor at George Mason University, and I write about a lot of different stuff. I'm not an academic Jewish studies scholar, but I have a layperson's interest in various issues, and I blog and I tweet, and I'm happy to be here.
And you really do tweet. You tweet a lot. Yeah, I don't spend that much time on Twitter, but it was my.
I'm a follower of your tweets, and a lot of our audience also follows your tweets. So this is great that you're here to speak with us.
Well, thanks for having me.
Adam, why don't you set the ball rolling?
What's that?
Why don't you set the ball rolling?
All right, yeah. So basically, what's happening is that Students for Justice in Palestine has been banned by the Florida governor, Ron DeSantis, from the public universities in Florida as a response to the toolkit that they sent out for the Al-Aqsa flood and a number of other activities that they're involved in have raised the eyebrows of a lot of people who think that they are going beyond the bounds of what a student organization ought to be doing. They have, over the last, even before October 7th, they, like a week or two beforehand, they announced that they celebrate, at least the National Umbrella Group announced that they celebrate the Second Intifada. And they chant from the river to the sea at their rallies, which is a call for genocide, and a whole host of other tactics of intimidation have been used by that organization. So Florida has done that. A number of other private universities like Brandeis, and this week, most recently, Columbia University, have also done the same thing. And the Columbia also has banned or suspended JVP, Jewish Voice for Peace, as well as SJP from their campus. Now, private universities, it's a lot easier to get away with suspending student organizations on the basis of their speech and what they believe. But public universities, like in Florida, there is a big question as to whether or not their First Amendment rights of free expression, free speech, and free assembly are being curtailed by Governor DeSantis's policy here. So I want to ask our guest, David Bernstein, if the argument in favor of the Students for Justice in Palestine being permitted First Amendment rights, and that what is happening in Florida is illegal. Will that hold up in court? What is your expert opinion on this?
So, first of all, I was reading up on this yesterday. It turns out that while DeSantis has issued this order, so far, the two universities that have SJP chapters, the two state universities in Florida, have not yet complied because they want to check their own legal obligations. So they have some reasonable doubts, I guess, in their minds. They want to make sure they're not going to get sued. My view on this is that if ultimately all they're doing is engaging in hate speech is constitutionally protected, and you're not going to be able to ban them. Although, Doesn't mean you need to treat them any better than you would treat a KKK group on campus, which would also be constitutionally protected. So it doesn't mean you have to go out of your way to be nice to them or not criticize them. But DeSantis's order was based on the notion that they are providing material support to terrorism. There are state materials, not every state has them, but many states, including I think Florida, have statutes banning material support to designated terrorist groups, which Hamas is. The federal government has such a law. And the material support statute is kind of vague. There isn't a lot of case law, and there's even less case law with regard to state statutes. But I think what it comes down to is you need something more than just the fact that they are engaging in hateful speech. Clearly, if they are coordinating with Hamas in some way, Hamas being a designated terrorist group, they do not have a First Amendment right to do that. They'd be undermining national security, national military and security policy by doing that. So that's one aspect. Another is simply if there are sufficient connections from national SJP to student SJPs to people who are involved with designated terrorist groups, that could also be a reason that you could legally ban them. So the question is, when DeSantis did this, was this more of a political stunt as part of his presidential campaign, where he really doesn't have anything beyond, well, they're doing something that's really bad and unpopular, which isn't a legal reason to ban them? Or, he has some smart lawyers around. There are a lot of suspicions, rumors, speculation that SJP does get support, funding, encouragement, collaboration from people who are at least in practice members of Hamas or affiliated with Hamas in some way, and maybe some other terrorist groups. And one of the notions here might be that if I take the lead, DeSantis might be saying, in doing this, I don't necessarily have all the evidence right now. The Justice Department should in fact be looking into this, but I don't know that they are. Not that, if it was the Republican Justice Department, they might be. I don't know if the Biden Justice Department will be doing that. But if, one thing you might think to yourself is, if you have enough suspicion about this, you might think, well, let's see if when this does go into effect, if SJP actually sues. If they sue and Florida governor and the universities argue in response, well, you're engaging in material support for terrorism, you're collaborating with Hamas, you're doing things in coordination, you're trying to promote Hamas as such, as opposed to just saying we kind of like what they're doing, you're actually trying to promote what they're doing. Any of those things could potentially make DeSantis's order valid, and the way to find those out would be through discovery. And so,
can I hold that thought for 1 second? I would not back up for a second. Back to the issue of you can't just ban hate speech, right? There has to be something more action, more link to terrorism. I want to find out, why can't hate speech itself be banned? Okay, I acknowledge that there's the First Amendment, but a campus organization has to.
My understanding is the First Amendment doesn't actually apply. It's the wrong.
Hang on a second. In order for a student organization to exist on a campus, it has to register with something like Student Activities Office, right? And when they are doing that, they are actually given things by the university, such as funding, resources, university campus space, and also a faculty advisor. So why is any group just automatically entitled to these things?
Well, basically, the Supreme Court has said pretty consistently that maybe you may not need to allow or fund official campus student groups at all, but once you do, the university has to be ideologically neutral. It's called, the regulations have to be content neutral. So you could say there's no protesting in front of outside the window of the president's house at 2 a.m., but you can't say that the Catholics could do it, but the anti-abortion people can't. Or whatever, or the other way around. You know what I mean? So that's not most countries. The United States has the most expansive definition of free speech in the world, I think, at this point. And basically, in practice, if the student government decided to give them less money or whatever, it'd be pretty hard to sue them and prove it was ideological discrimination. But as a general matter, university policy can't be, well, we like what this group is saying, we don't like what that group is saying, so we're going to.
Even if they're calling for the death of people and genocide and terrorism and all of that?
Even if they're calling for that, like I said, in theory, it could be the local American Nazi Party at University of Florida, the Ku Klux Klan.
Well, I understand at the University of Louisville a few years ago, they tried to ban the KKK, and that wasn't permitted on the grounds that you're making now.
Hang on one sec, though. The calling for death, the problem with the phrase Palestine will be free from the river to the sea is that there's a margin of ambiguity there. Right? You can't say this definitely means kill the Jews. We all know that it really does. But people can argue that it means, oh, no, we just want to create one state called Palestine where everyone will have a vote, which,
But celebrating the Intifada, though, is a lot clearer. And so is celebrating of October 7th, right? It's clear what you're celebrating.
Well, for good or ill, celebrating violence is still considered constitutionally protected as long as you're not inciting violence. And I actually happen to think that, even though I'm a big free speech guy in general, I actually think Supreme Court precedent on what constitutes incitement is too narrow. But I mean, it really has to. If I were king, so to speak, if I were on the Supreme Court, I would say if a reasonable person would fear for their safety, personally, not like I'm a Jew and they don't like Jews, but death to the Jews of Florida state might actually be protected, because the Supreme Court, at least with regard to incitement, because the Supreme Court's view is that incitement only comes to the point where there's a danger of imminent lawlessness. So unless you're rousing up the crowd to go and lynch somebody right there, you can pretty much say whatever you want. I actually, this is one of these cases.
Absurd.
It is absurd. It was issued during the civil rights era, when some states were trying to crack down on certain civil rights protesters by suggesting they're engaging in incitement, and the Supreme Court wanted to take that tool away from them. But it is completely absurd. I mean,
one of the big cases was the Skokie, Illinois case,
right,
with March.
But that's not campus, though. I mean,
that's not campus.
Yeah. But so, okay, so just to hold on, to take the extreme example that I've seen thus far, the Professor DeCristo at UC Davis. Now, is this sufficiently incitement? Are you familiar with the tweets?
That
let's just repeat for our viewers what it is. She tweeted that we know who these Zionist journalists are. We can find out where they live. We can find out where their kids go to school. We can get the addresses. They should be really scared of us. Dagger, axe as our emojis.
That would be probable cause, I think, for the police or the FBI to search her house and her computer and her email and her cloud stuff and her social media to see if she has any actual plans to kill anybody, or if it's just rhetoric. But the rhetoric itself wouldn't be enough to arrest her. It may be enough, but there is a line. Professors have actually, while professors tend to think they can say whatever they want, professors have a bit less wiggle room than students or citizens in general, because they have a job, and you have to be, you don't want the state universities to be able to say, oh, if we decide that what you've said makes people feel unsafe, we could fire you. But at some point, if you say crazy enough things that would lead people to believe that you're not capable of doing your job of teaching all your students fairly, clearly, like, if she wants to kill Zionists, how could you be a Zionist in her class? That could actually be, at least in extreme cases like this, a grounds for suspension or firing or whatnot.
But then in that case, any professor who is and states that they're exhilarated by 10-7, like professors like Joseph Massad, most prominently, I mean, that would fall under the same rubric of what you just said.
That's the problem, is it's very hard to draw that line. At what point does saying something that sounds kind of crazy and violent mean that you're actually a properly perceived threat to your own students? It's one thing, I think, in Massad's case, to say, oh, what happened over in Israel is exhilarating. It'd be another thing if he said, that was exhilarating, I wish the same thing would happen here at Columbia.
Yeah, I think what Mossad said is protected, and there was a statement, a petition going around for his firing for 60,000 signatures the last time. I would never sign something like that because he's not actually calling for people to go and attack Jews. But the one from De Cristo, it's the only time in my life I have ever signed a statement calling for a professor to be fired, and I signed that one.
Yeah, and look, there's something that may have come up later in our conversation, but I'll just put it out there now. The problem with people like Mossad is not that they're saying these crazy things, which are protected. It's like, how does he have a job to begin with? I actually followed Mossad's career for quite a while. When I haven't paid attention lately because he's not really a scholar, so you only hear from him when he says ridiculous, outrageous things that get attention. But he, Colombia has a very anti-Israel, leftist, Islamist, all that stuff, Middle Eastern Studies department. But he, like I said, he's not really a scholar. They denied him tenure.
Oh, he doesn't have tenure?
He does. So this is the thing. Somehow, there were allegations. There were allegations of him saying discriminatory things to Jewish students. He has
that Barry Weiss made some, if I recall correctly.
Yes, yeah, that was the beginning of her public career, more or less. And he also has this crazy theory that there's something called what he calls gay international that's imposing homosexual, Western attitudes about homosexuality onto traditional Muslim societies that don't have such a conception, and thus they are engaging in thought imperialism, I guess. So he's not a scholar. He has really ridiculous ideas. He said things about Israel are just false, I would say, not just ideologically bad. And he was denied tenure by his own department. Somehow Columbia, I don't remember what department he did get tenure in. Somehow Columbia allowed him to go up for tenure again the following year in a different department that agreed to let him be tenured there. It's like, I've never heard of that, of that ever happening to anybody. I don't know. He must have had someone in the administration, right, who was really friendly. So that's an extreme example. But the issue to me, a big issue with free speech on campus now is, we have these occasional cases where someone who's right wing or left wing gets silenced or is threatened with being silenced. But the bigger problem is that someone like you guys, no matter how, with your views, no matter how great your scholarship was, if you were Middle Eastern Studies scholarships, you can never get hired somewhere like Columbia. They don't announce it, but they clearly have an ideological litmus test, as do most Middle Eastern Studies departments. None of you go to Middle Eastern Studies, you look at the, I remember a few years back there was a Middle Eastern Studies conference and they had a panel on BDS, and the question was, we all agree basically that Israel is really, really terrible and should be destroyed. But is BDS the right way of going about that, or is it not? I mean, this is basically the panels. Like, how do you have an academic field where everyone basically agrees that way? And the answer is they control the departments, and you don't get hired if you have other points of view.
There is a university, and I won't name it, and I know this from the inside because it was told by someone who was at the meeting, and I believe this is the order of things the way it happened. The search committee chose someone for a Jewish history position, and then I believe the committee chose this person as their candidate, and they brought it to the department vote, and it was going to look like it was going to go for this person, and they discovered he was, quote, a Zionist, like fairly publicly, and the department ended up vetoing it. And this is a state university. I mean, to my mind, that is illegal. We have a rule in my university that if you're on a search committee, you can't look this person up in social media whatsoever when you analyze the list of job candidates. Now, whether people actually, follow that,
hard to prove.
Yeah, it would be very difficult to prove. Yeah, and other people in the department, I believe, are allowed to look up. It's just the search committee is not allowed to go and investigate the people in question.
And we have a very broad FOIA law in Virginia, but I think even in Virginia, communications about hire, right? Because you don't really want to get out like that someone said, this guy's work is a piece of shit, and then have to run into the person at a conference. But the downside of that is, to the extent people are foolish enough to put this kind of thing in email, unless someone actually sues and gets discovery, you'll never find out what really happens.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So what about that guy? I mean, this is another great example here. Katz, the archaeologist at Harvard, who wrote that letter. Oh, he's at Princeton. Yeah, he called BLM in print in the summer 2020 a terrorist organization, and they couldn't fire him for saying that, so they dredged up this sexual, whatever you want to call it, thing from 2007, 13 years earlier. And he was investigated. He had a consensual relationship with an undergrad, which in 2007, who the hell knows if they're, how much they were enforcing that stuff. But he was reprimanded. There was an investigation. It was allegedly resolved, and their claim was that he did not properly cooperate. I think I'm getting that right, with the investigation, and they fired him based on that 13 years later.
Yeah, well, I mean, 2020 was as you all lived through, it was a very authoritarian moment in American life and the academy, and and saying the wrong thing then was really problematic. I mean, I guess he could. I don't know. The problem is, if you do wind up in that situation, like he wound up at AEI now, you could sue and maybe win, but if you get a job that pays you as much, regardless, you're not going to get any damages, and you have to drag yourself through litigation and be subject to discovery and maybe cross-examine about if you did anything else ever improper, even though it's not really relevant. But yeah, I mean, look, the universities are a huge mess. People who are on the who are not within the dominant left-wing paradigm are at much more danger in general, of especially elite schools, of if they say the wrong thing, of getting into big trouble. Happened also at Yale with Ian Ayres, not Ian Ayres, I'm sorry Ian, didn't mean to mention you, with Jed, what's his last name? Jed something, who was speaking out against some of the Me Too excesses along with some other faculty members. And all of a sudden, I mean, frankly, it was kind of an open secret that he had relationships with students, but no one really cared until, these are law students, not undergraduates, and no one really cared until he sort of raised the ire of some of the feminists on campus, because he was saying, hey, people accused of Me Too kind of violations need to have due process, and then they went after him. So it's not so much that some of the people, like, he may have in fact violated various rules. He was suspended for a year or something and all that, but this is when this is one of the essences of an authoritarian system, is that you have a list of offenses out there that's very broad, and you could then use it against someone when you want to, and that's sort of what was happening. I mean, I think things have calmed down significantly since the 2020 period. And I think everything was exacerbated by COVID. People had nothing better to do than go on witch hunts, I guess. But being stuck at home.
But we still do it on our podcast. We're not calling everyone to get fired, but we're just having a lot of fun doing it.
So, but back to the issue of Florida, what do you think is going to happen here?
Just before you answer that, this is Jermaine. When they said material support for terrorism, what specifically did they mean in this context? I didn't read the details of it.
I wish I could tell you I'd actually gone back and read it before the podcast to be prepared, but I didn't. So I don't recall exactly. They didn't. It was a very short order. It was several paragraphs, so there was no great detail about what was going on. But they said, they just use the phrase material support, so they've been supporting Hamas, and we're going to ban them. And if, frankly, if you're a good lawyer, if they do have anything on SJP, you wouldn't want to put it in a memo. Yes, it's sort of better politics to set it out front, but from a lawyer's perspective, when they come and sue you, you want to spring it on them, essentially, not give them a chance to, not give them more time than necessary to figure out how to defend themselves or explain.
But right now, there have not been any lawsuits yet from SJP because the universities have not implemented it yet.
Right, although that would not necessarily stop a lawsuit. You could ask for an injunction beforehand.
Right.
I mean, I do suspect that I have no real inside knowledge of where SJP's funding from or what ties it has, but I suspect that even if they're not in violation of material support laws, if you actually got to a litigation where you got to look into their origins and their connections and all that, it would at least be sufficiently embarrassing to them that they don't, that I'm not sure that they will sue, especially because there is an easy alternative. The easy alternative would just be for the same students who formed
Change the
SJP
name.
to
Yeah.
just change the name, not
Yeah.
have a formal affiliation with a national group, and keep doing what they're doing.
But the national group, SJP, compared to, let's say, Hillel, strikes me as being very decentralized. It's almost as if each SJP chapter is independent. They don't follow the national guidelines necessarily. So when the national SJP literally celebrated the Second Intifada, this is before October 7th. Now, I think now everyone's celebrating it, but I mean, before that, it was horrifying to read that. But the way they have, if you examine their websites and the individual SJP chapters, it's almost as if they're autonomous institutions and they're not bound by what the national SJP says. And
right, which frankly, I mean, I'm not here to give SJP helpful legal advice, but if students came to me,
I'm sure they're not watching our podcast.
Right, exactly. If someone came to me and said, "Hey, we want to start a anti-Israel, pro-Palestinian organization on campus. We're thinking of affiliating with SJP so we get the resources and go to the national." I say, don't. I said, you're going to be pretty autonomous anyway, and unless if they're promising you money, that's sketchy, because where is that money coming from? And they're not promising you money. You could do everything you could do as an SJP chapter without any of the baggage of SJP by just calling it something else.
Right, right. Like when Hillel, when some Hillels didn't want to follow the national Hillel guidelines, they changed their name to Open Hillel. And I don't know in practice what that meant in terms of funding, but they decided to do whatever the hell they wanted.
Isn't that a good thing, though? A win? Yeah, that these groups cannot call themselves SJP, right? Because it shows us something about the umbrella group.
I don't know. It's possible that SJP nationally is a sufficiently sketchy organization. It wouldn't be the first time that there is sort of relatively innocuous sounding anti-Israel, Muslim-oriented organization that wound up, in fact, in bed with people who are under U.S. sanction. I have very separately done some work as a consultant on sanctions law, which I was really previously, I wasn't asked to consult for my expertise in sanctions law, but rather on evidence and constitutional law. And American sanction laws are extremely broad. There's no due process involved. It's very easy to run afoul of them. So if you're a national SJP and you have been in contact with in any financial way with a sanctioned group or individual, you're in big trouble. Your assets could be seized, and that's besides the possible criminal penalties. And if you're a student group and you're affiliated with that, you're a co-conspirator essentially.
But what if it's not directly connected? A lot of times you may have funding coming from an organization or a foundation of some sort that gets its money from another foundation that is innocuous, that gets its money from some innocuous foundation, which gets its money from a terrorist group, right? So it goes, there's a multi-step process.
Like I said, the case law on material support is really quite vague. So I suspect that courts would hold that to be subject to at least criminal penalty as opposed to civil. Civil penalties are a lot easier. Criminal penalty, that the chapter or the people involved with the chapter would have to, in some sense, know they're coordinating with Hamas on the one hand. On the other hand, state statutes in particular tend to be sufficiently broad. They haven't been upheld or not yet because there hasn't really been done anything, but some of them just say basically, if you are trying to help Hamas. So you could say we think Hamas is great, what they did is great, we want them to do more of it. But if you're doing it with a purpose of making it easier for Hamas to engage in more terrorist acts, then you're violating some of these statutes. I don't know whether those will be upheld or not. Again, there is one, it's a weird case name. It's like some Islamic charity versus the United States. The Supreme Court basically gave a pretty broad view of what can constitute material support. It's not just praising the group, but some of the it's on and a lot of language is what we call dicta, right? It's not binding, but just like here are some examples of what you might do. And some of those things were just like you were trying to you knew that I forget the exact wording, but it's along the lines of, oh, it was the Holy Land Foundation case. That's what it was, Holy Land Foundation. Basically, you knew that what you were doing was going to materially help Hamas. It's not, so it's one thing to just speak out in favor because but if you are doing it with the intention of aiding Hamas, then you're in material support. So we'll see. I mean, I happened to be at a conference with a bunch of lawyers on Friday where they were talking about these material support statutes, and what I learned from it was that the language of them is pretty broad at the federal level. It's even broader at the state level. Federal courts have allowed fairly, speech-oriented things to at least be depicted as included, but there's just so little case law that no one really knows what will happen if states or the feds aren't going to do it because it's the Biden administration and there'll be too much internal opposition. But if states got going after SJP for material support, of course, a lot depends on what would happen in discovery, in a criminal, or what they could prove in a criminal trial. But regardless, we don't really know because even under the federal statutes, there's very, very little precedent out there, and there's nothing in the various states.
And it's something that can fall either on the federal or the state jurisdiction, right? They both have, they're both empowered to take action if they see.
Yeah, I mean, it's that, that's another thing that hasn't really been addressed is the preemption issue. Can state laws have stronger material support statutes in the federal statute? Is it preempted by the federal statute? Is it the states getting too much involved in foreign policy? I suspect to the extent that it's civil penalty, right? I remember, if you remember the cases involving the Swiss banks that were alleged to have kept Holocaust money, and the banks tried to get out of it by saying, well, we settled this with the federal government 50 years ago, so we're done. And the state courts and federal courts say, nope, that was your settlement with the government, but individual states or individual plaintiffs could still go after you. So at least that seems like something of a precedent, that you're not completely preempted just because the federal government has a similar statute.
Are the private universities going to have any problems here? Because there are limitations on what private universities that accept federal subsidies are allowed to do. Like Yeshiva University was told they could not ban an LGBT club.
Yes. So, I mean, first of all, some of the universities, I'm not, just from what I've read, I don't have any particular expertise in the matter, but apparently every time there's a story about this, people researching it keep finding billions of dollars in foreign money that universities are required to disclose every year to the government, and they haven't been doing it. So once again, can we imagine the Biden administration going after Georgetown, or I'm not sure if Georgetown was on the list, but imagine Georgetown or University of Pennsylvania or Cornell, and threatening their federal funding or threatening a huge fine because they do not disclose they got $1 billion from Qatar or whatever. I would say that we will not expect the Biden administration to do it, although there would be some lawyers who would be eager to, but I don't think the administration would do it. In the Republican administration, I think they'd be happy to do it because these universities are not their favorite groups right now. And there's an additional question: is there something private plaintiffs could do? I was suggesting to a friend of mine, there is an action called a qui tam action, where if people are defrauding the federal government, you could sue as a private plaintiff and collect some of the money. So I don't know enough about what the disclosure rules and how much funding is dependent on disclosure, but there's something to explore. There's also, as I'm sure both of you are aware, these Middle Eastern studies departments are funded by Title VI of some act or other. I forget what it's called. It's not the Title VI that Civil Rights Act cases come from under the 1964 Civil Rights Act. It's some federally funding. We want people to know enough about the Middle East and enough Arabic and Urdu and all that. So we're giving money to these universities, and the universities every year have to sign off that they have ideologically balanced programs. I forget the exact language, and they don't. But the problem, as I understand it, is every time Congress people have tried to go after this, even the conservative Republicans don't go along because they say, well, Duke is in my district. I don't want to take away money from a university in my district. But this kind of thing has to stop, right? This little playing, the log rolling and special interest politics. Oh, I want to help my district. This is a serious matter where the U.S. government is funding completely one-sided Middle Eastern studies programs where people are getting not just an anti-Israel narrative, an anti-American narrative. These departments are filled with Islamists and radical leftists who are from countries that are not friendly to the United States. They have ideologies that are, the authoritarian. They have this, anti-colonial ideologies that say that, U.S. is always the bad guy, Israel is always the bad guy no matter what they do, and the oppressed colonial country, oppressed colonists, i.e. the Arab countries, and there's no matter what they do is false. Why are we funding this? It's one thing to even say you can't stop a university under the First Amendment from funding itself whatever it wants, whatever ideology it wants. So why are taxpayers in the United States, with a law that says the programs have to be balanced, financing completely imbalanced programs?
The irony is that, Jewish studies would never fall under something like Title VI to learn about a different ethnic group and whatnot. So most of these Jewish studies positions come from wealthy Jewish donors who tend to have a conservative bent. Yet, nevertheless, these positions end up getting filled with the very same type of people who end up in Middle Eastern studies and gender studies and all those programs.
Yeah, I had a really popular tweet just yesterday or Friday, maybe it was. I had over 350,000 views where I said, we've talked about this privately before, Jared, but this is now something that people are paying attention to finally, that Jewish donors need to stop being suckers. I said, inevitably, some of these universities, Cornell, Penn, whoever, who've been having anti-Semitism problems, are going to go to their traditional donor base and say, hey, we really feel bad about this. What we really want to do to make life more comfortable for Jewish students on campus, we want to add an Israel studies chair and expand our Jewish studies program. And I said two things about this, which I think, maybe someone watching this it'll matter to them. Maybe they're a donor. Say, look, number one, the people who staff these programs are not necessarily friendly to Jews or Israel. So you're not accomplishing what you think you are. Number two, and I think even more important, why should they go to the Jewish donors for this? Could you imagine if there was an outbreak of homophobia on campus at Penn, that Penn would go to some like Broadway producer or something who's a wealthy gay man and say, we need a new gay studies chair. And he'd say, go fuck yourself. You have a homophobic problem. You deal with it. Don't ask what chutzpah you have to ask me. Or if you had an anti-black, racism program, should you imagine them going to the head of BET or other wealthy black individuals saying, we have this big racism problem. We want to solve that by expanding our African American Studies department. They say, no, you do that. You're the ones who have the problem. Use it out of your own. Take whatever measures you need to take out of your own funds. Don't expect us to do it.
Which is what's happening with African American studies and whatnot, right? They suddenly all found this money. All these universities found the money in 2020 to have, quote, diversity hires.
Look, the worst example of all this, which I don't think should have gotten more attention, but then I talked about on my blog. This was almost 20 years ago. We were talking about Columbia. So Columbia was having these anti-Semitism in their Middle East Studies Department allegations, and at the very least, Jewish students who wanted to study with someone who wasn't entirely hostile to Israel's existence had no one to go to. So Columbia found, I don't remember who it was, but some sucker, a wealthy alum, who gave them $6 million to found an Israel Studies chair. Now, I haven't followed exactly what happened with the Israel Studies chair, but last I heard was that when they created the committee to decide who is going to be on the Israel Studies chair committee, they stocked it with people from the Middle Eastern Studies Department who had the problem to begin with.
It's unbelievable. Yeah, no, it's really unbelievable. But the administration, to a certain extent, I think, is clueless about some of this stuff, right? They don't know. And the subject of our lightning episode last week was Professor at Carleton, Mira Sukharov, who is now serving as a consultant to the provost for establishing an anti-Semitism task force at her university. But everything she's written in the last 5 years and said publicly has been, promoting the anti-Zionist side. Not only that, propagating people who have engaged in anti-Semitism significantly.
The very people that they tap to solve this anti-Semitism problem are the problem.
Yeah,
this is happening everywhere.
Which the silver lining is this provides ammunition for a Title VI complaint if anyone wants to file one. Like, okay, you're now acknowledging of an anti-Semitism problem because you have a task force on it, and you're not actually taking it seriously because you're putting people on the committee who are part of the problem. So you're violating the law. Now, if I remember correctly, John, you're at a state university, is that right?
Me?
Yeah.
Yeah, we're both at state universities.
Yeah.
So I mean, that's the kind of thing also you have to be in a red state. If that's, I mean, I don't know anything about your situation, but if that's what they're doing, this is something that some enterprising politician in the state legislature should be interested in.
Well, I am
Especially right
I am
now.
Jewish studies at my
Neither
university.
of us
for all
have
intents
this
and purposes.
problem.
We don't have a problem at my university.
Neither
so
do
far.
we.
Oh, I thought that was happening at your university where you said that they had the task force.
No. That's Carleton.
That's Carleton.
Carleton,
That's
I'm
in
sorry.
Canada too. No, there's no
Right.
problem at my university, and I hope it stays that way. We don't have an SJP. We certainly do have Palestinian students. The Muslim Student Association, I've talked to them. The student president is a militant anti-Zionist. He felt it necessary to tell me this when I was having an otherwise pleasant conversation with him. It's like, what are you bothering? But they sit around and study the Quran all day. They're not really. I think they've gotten a little more activist since October 7th. From what I understand, but there is probably more harassment of Muslims on my campus than of Jews, near as I can tell. So we don't have an anti-Semitism problem. It's a red state, and it's not Chapel Hill, which does have a big problem at this point. Chapel Hill is a massive problem with the worst and definitely the worst of all the public North Carolina universities. I imagine Duke is pretty bad too. But that's obviously a private school. And Duke University Press has a habit of publishing anti-Semitic works like Jasper Puar and her blood libel organ harvesting crap. Just to throw that out there. What about the case in California from a legal perspective? You, I'm sure, remember this from, I guess it's been 3 years already, with Leila Khaled. Remember there was that Middle Eastern Studies professor, the one who founded that new center.
State. It was at San Francisco State.
San Francisco State, yeah.
Yeah, so I have to say, like, I haven't thought about that in the last 3 years. I think that they actually used those material support statutes to say that if you're having, if you're she's an open member of the PFLP, whatever that, I can't recall.
She actually committed terrorism.
Well, right, but she was released. So if she was no longer a terrorist, I don't think you could say that it would be material support. But since she was still affiliated with terrorist organizations, still promoting terrorism,
She was going to teach the lecture on how to resist. I mean, come on, a convicted terrorist,
right?
A rapist who's been rehabilitated gives a class on how to date women. I mean, it's absurd.
Right, but as I recall, they ultimately weren't able. That actually, I think some of the universities said we're not going to do it, but they eventually told the carriers.
It was Zoom. No, Zoom is the one that stepped in. They pulled the plug and said, no, we believe this violates material terrorist laws, so we're not going to do it. The university hadn't said anything up until that point. Right. And then she started presenting on YouTube, and then YouTube pulled the plug about 5 minutes into the presentation. So I'm not sure the university actually did anything.
Well, I think there are other universities that declined to host this kind of thing because of, they got this letter from which I forget which group it was, but one of the Israeli or Jewish groups saying we will pursue you for material support for terrorism if you do this. So the material support statute has some weight to it, and I think look, there's been a lot of, there are all these groups out there doing their thing, and some of them are more effective than others. But I think on the legal side, there's been, maybe it's just because I'm the law professor, but I think there's been a little bit of complacency. There hasn't been aggressive enough investigation and use of some of these things. Well, that's the thing. I mean, near as I can tell, Palestine legal is very well organized, and their faculty seem to be very much in bed with them. And I'm not sure there's an equivalent for Jews on campus. I mean, Hillel is a cultural association that affiliates with Israel, but they're not an Israel activist organization by any means whatsoever. Well, look, I know some of the players like Ken Marcus, who I was going to ask you about Ken Marcus actually at Brandeis Center. There's several others that are working this kind of thing. But when someone says, who do I go to? I mean, now there can among others or organize some law firms to help, but still it's not really clear if you're going to ask me like what kind of complaint should go to which organization and which would be the one that would be most effective at it, I have no idea really. I know Ken, so I tend to refer people to the Brandeis Center. It could very well be in particular context they'd be better off going to Stand With Us or one of the other groups that does this stuff.
Lawfare Project.
Lawfare Project. I mean, actually, at the same meeting I was mentioning that I went to over the weekend, various lawyers and law professors were there, and people were sort of volunteering, like, what could I do? But there's no clearinghouse. I said, I mean, not me, I'm not an organization guy. I don't organize things. I just talk and write. But someone should have a database of, well, lawyers willing to help and what their areas of expertise are. You know, there's corporate law issues, there is education law issues, there's First Amendment issues, and no one has such a thing. It's all very ad hoc.
Well, the way I see it, organizations like the one that Adam and I founded, the Jewish Studies Zionist Network, need to find people in the legal realm to coordinate with, and also, get in touch with donors and stuff. There needs to be this, more better communication, channels of communication with people outside of just academics like us who are making a lot of noise in public. And we have a lot of academics who are at problematic universities that are working behind the scenes. We have had no need to do that because we don't have problems at our schools.
I mean, I wish there was a way these donors who've been withholding funds from Harvard and Penn and so forth, I mean, they should have been doing it long ago, of course, but it's good they're doing it now. But what I haven't heard is that they're reaching out to the kind of people who could tell them, like, like they're sort of pissed because, Penn, well, we told the president of the university that she needs to do something with this anti-Semitic poetry festival. She didn't do anything, and she didn't come. They're kind of offended, like, hey, I'm a big gun, and you're not, like, sort of paying attention to my concerns. But what they really need to be doing is to be consulting with disinterested, in the sense of they don't have a stake in Penn or not in Penn, or Harvard, not Harvard, disinterested people like us, like people who are academic researchers, who could say, hey, we know you want to help, we know you want your name out there, we know you want to be a friend of education, higher education. Here's how you could do it intelligently and with your values, because they don't really, these boards of directors and so forth, they basically, their job has been for many years, you write a check and you get a nice picture taken with the president of the university, and you get to frame it on your wall and show what a great patriot of education you are. But if you want to, these are very bright people who made a lot of money being very smart in finance and industry, and they haven't been very smart about their philanthropy. They've seen it as just sort of a little hobby on the side that gets them a little prestige, and they need to be. Why throw away $50 million?
A militant anti-Zionist could have easily ended up with the job that I had. I mean, I won't name names or anything, but I do know, people who interviewed for it and whatnot. So yeah, no, it's a major issue. But I've also gotten a sense that I'm speaking about no universities in particular here at the moment, that a lot of places where there isn't a problem don't really want to start establishing programs right now that involve Israel, and conversely probably Palestine too. I don't think it's necessarily a Jewish issue. I think it's like, where if we do that now, we are going to be creating a political problem at our university that we really don't need.
Sure.
And that's unfortunate. That's sad.
If anyone happens to be watching or listening to this who is a donor, the number, and you're going to say, what's your number one piece of advice? Well, after you do all your due diligence and all that, nevertheless, key piece of advice: never endow anything. Give a 1-year grant, a 3-year grant, a 5-year grant.
Yeah, no, it has to be, absolutely. There has to be renewable with strings attached. Absolutely. No,
that's how you have leverage. Once the money's out of your hands, even if you have a donor agreement, right? Then you have to follow up, and you have to sue, and courts are not, you want to
or there's another way. So there was, I forgot what university it was, but there was some center created for conservative studies in some way. I don't remember who the donor was, but they had an endowment set up so that there was a third party, Hillsdale College, to oversee the endowment and make sure that the money is used wisely, and they could pull the plug on the whole thing. I think that donors should set up something like that. If they are going to establish an endowment, have the Jewish Studies Zionist Network as that third party to oversee the use of their funds.
You want us to be doing that? To oversee
Yeah,
it?
yeah, I want us to be doing that.
That
Yeah.
sounds like a very big project. We need more people to get on
We'll get other people
our
involved.
committee.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
We need volunteers to step up.
Even then, just like the Ford Foundation was run by someone by the Ford family for a while, got taken over. I would never, even if I was confident that for 30 or 50 years, right, that the money would be handled well, I would then.
So you're talking about O'Sullivan's Law.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So Sutherland's Law, for those who are familiar, is
Yeah.
any institution that's not explicitly and overtly right wing gradually becomes very left wing eventually
Over time. Yeah.
over time.
Yeah.
So and the centrifugal forces in the university are that way. So even if I was very confident for the next 30 years, my endowment will be used wisely, there's really no way of making sure that's going to be true indefinitely. So there's no reason to ever give a permanent endowment.
What about the University of Washington? Do you know the details of that? Because Becky Benaroya, the donor, withdrew, somehow got her $5 million back because Leora Halpern turned out to be an anti-Zionist, and they were infuriated that she had the chair.
I have no idea. I don't know what the agreement said. I don't know why they might have just decided that. My guess, without knowing the details, would be that she was friendly with other big donors, and if she was not giving her money back, it would probably cost them more than the $5 million. So they decided that the better course was just to quiet her down, give her the money. But I don't know, because it's very unusual that you have it didn't sound like from the news report that there was something that gave her the right to keep to decide.
Right. It sounds like the university voluntarily decided to do that, and of course there was a Jewish studies petition calling on them calling on the donor not to pull the money back. Of course that carries no weight, as most statements don't carry any weight. But the university ended up coming up with the $5 million to fund her chair, so she didn't lose the endowed position. I mean, she already had tenure, so she would have stayed in the department, but she would have been reduced to just your average tenured schlep. So they did, they again, going back to university politics and all that, I mean, they're going to keep someone with a left-wing bent if they like them enough, right, even if the money's taken away. Yeah, and $5 million if they want to.
And I think that the donors have to be aware that these are systemic problems. So I saw some of the Penn donors are now saying we'll only give $1 as long as Liz McGill is still president. But bringing in Larry Summers, who is much sounder on every related issue, isn't going to change. Just like he couldn't change Harvard, there's a limited amount of what he could do at Penn. So changing the president, he'll say better things and he'll present it better, but you'll still have all these departments and so forth. And the criteria needs to be institutional change, not just change in the figurehead at the top. And that's very difficult. It probably won't happen. So you have to, if you're a donor to Penn, you just have to be ready to say, as much as I love Penn, as much as I had a great experience there, what Penn has become is not going to be changed easily unless I see real change. It's unlikely. I'm just going to have to either give the money somewhere else, or if you want to help Penn, you may not get your name on a building, but you give money to Chabad. If the Hillel, not all Hillels are sound, but the Hillel, so you give money to them. You can give money to particular students who are researching Jewish issues that you think are important, and help them with their PhDs and so forth. I mean, a lot of other ways that you could help the institution without giving up control of the money.
Right, that's true. We actually do have a fund for researching Holocaust projects for undergrads and graduate students, from a donor that wanted to do something like that, and I believe it's ongoing. I think it has to be renewed all the time. So
you don't want the money going to start researching the Nakba. Well, that's a Holocaust too. You can imagine.
Yeah, no one's tried to pull that yet. I don't know what would happen. It's a very good question. I've supervised a few terrific projects from people who've used the money. Wait, what was I going to ask about the donors again? Oh, but in terms of changing things, the systemic problems, isn't that what DeSantis is trying to do? He's trying to use his political clout to intervene in state universities.
Yeah, so he is, and the most promising thing that I've seen in several states, is red states exclusively, is the legislature taking some of the money or adding money to the university allocation and saying we're going to fund an independent, conservative, free market, whatever oriented thing. It's not officially ideological, but it's clearly meant to be a counterbalance, because it'd be great to get rid of the gender queer studies department and all the post-colonial and whatever stuff, but very hard.
Yet some states are doing it. Some red states are actually, they're saying, well, we don't need this department, and we're declaring a financial.
Right. So I mean, I would get rid of, no offense to the Jewish studies professors out there. I would start with the presumption anything that has the word studies in it should be gone.
If it's an identity politics discipline or field, I absolutely agree with you. I think Jewish historians should be housed in history departments. They should be trained as historians. And yeah, they shouldn't be overseen by a Jewish studies program. They should not be housed there. Their tenure should not be there.
Well, I don't know. I think that these things should be multidisciplinary. So I understand the studies label to it.
You can have programs with an affiliation from them, but I think it's important. I don't like these programs, including Jewish studies, where professors are actually hired by these programs. And very often, a lot of them, because the programs themselves are multidisciplinary, the people hired are trained. They get their PhDs in interdisciplinary programs, and they're not trained as anything. No. I don't think people who have PhDs in American studies, Africana studies, and I'll say Jewish studies too, I don't think they are methodologically qualified to teach in any academic field.
Yeah, well, I'm fine with that. I agree.
Yeah, they're not. I say most history departments will not hire people trained in those fields.
I wasn't really planning to do this, but actually I shouldn't go a whole hour-long podcast, but a book plug of my book. So I have a book that came out last year called Classified, The Untold Story of Racial Classification.
Oh, yeah, I saw that, yeah.
Which is about what it sounds like. It's about modern racial classifications. But just out of curiosity, after I published the book, I went to Latino studies departments around the country. And I was really looking for, I was wondering whether in Latino studies, intro to Latino studies, whether the professors on their syllabi ask the obvious first question it should be asked, which is, does this whole field make any sense? Because what do Mexican American immigrants have in common with Argentines, and what do they have in common with Puerto Ricans and so forth? But no one does. But the more interesting thing was when I was on the websites of the different programs, the vast majority of the professors, who had admittedly generally Spanish sounding last names, looked like us. They were not, when people talk about, we need representation of Black and brown, these were not the brown. These are, so and they were not, as a rule, very distinguished scholars when I glanced at their resumes. And so the strong impression I got, and I'm sure there are exceptions, is that a lot of these people and a lot of them were trained in history or political science or anthropology or sociology, but they weren't good enough to get a job in the actual field. But because they figured out at some point, well, since my last name is Gutierrez or Lopez, if I just write something about something Hispanic, there's all these jobs available and there's not that much, as much competition. They just wind up in these places.
Well, they need the last name or whatever to check off the box. Well, I guess somehow Elizabeth Warren was able to pass as a Native American, so maybe you don't even need a name in all cases.
Well, someone did a statistical analysis once suggesting that the likelihood is that all Ashkenazi Jews have some Sephardic ancestry. They did this sort of complicated formula. Here's how many Ashkenazi Jews, here's how many Sephardic Jews we think wound up in Eastern Europe, and here's how many generations it's been, so, et cetera. So, all the official criteria under the law for being Hispanic is that you're Spanish origin or culture, not and culture. It should be and culture. It's not. So technically, if any Ashkenazi Jews feel like they want to rediscover their Sephardic roots, they could check the boxes.
Well, we should be eligible for Arab studies programs because we came out of the Middle East. I imagine that our tribal ancestry is very much intertwined with Arab tribes from the pre-monotheistic era.
Well, these leftist Arab American and Iranian American groups are trying to get a new Middle Eastern studies, Middle Eastern and North African classification endorsed by the federal government. The Biden administration has proposed doing it, but they haven't finalized it yet.
It's so absurd, and I'm publicly objecting to it right now.
I actually wrote a formal objection, but one of the objections that I wrote was that it's a completely ridiculous. It's supposed to essentially be either a proxy for Arab or a proxy for Muslim. But if you look at the data, half the people in it are not going to be Arab and half of them aren't going to be Muslim. And a very large chunk either way are going to be Israeli because they're included. So like what does Shlomo Greenwald have in common, with someone from Azerbaijan or Egypt who's a Muslim?
Well, I had a student years ago when I was teaching at Ohio University, and I think he was born in Cuba, but his parents were Holocaust refugees who happened to spend a weekend in Cuba, a few years, and
Right.
he happened to be born there, and he comes to America, and he's allowed to check off the Latino box. And I find that so utterly absurd. I mean, they're not really ethnic categories. They're political categories masquerading as ethnic categories. Right, with the exception of African Americans. I mean, I'll give.
Well, even there, why people who are just recently immigrated from
right, I 100% agree with you. Yeah, immigrants from Africa are not African Americans in the same way, right?
Right. So basically, you just summarized one of the major themes in my book. So thank you.
Yeah,
the political categories and they're very historically contingent. They could have easily been gone different ways if they had been done, like if they had been done in 1950, Jews might actually be a classification, although Jewish groups at the time would have objected to it.
Well, Jews were racialized in the interwar period, but since we were legally classified as a religion, the quotas against us needed to go through, back channels. They couldn't do it explicitly because we were not defined as a race.
Right.
But the Ashkenazi Jews were, for all intents and purposes, racialized between 1920 and the end of World War II, and they were treated as such.
Right,
much as the Irish were in the early 1800s.
The first, we're getting a little bit off topic here, but just
to wrap up in a few minutes anyway.
The first surveys that the federal government gave to government contractors in the 50s when they're trying to enforce civil rights laws, it was not even laws. There were civil rights executive orders from Eisenhower that said you can't discriminate. And the initial surveys specified Jews as one category that we want to know whether you're discriminating. And African American civil rights groups objected. They said, race is the big thing, and Jews are not a different race, and Jews were not that keen on being singled out, regardless. And they weren't. It was considered either impolite or illegal to ask people, "Are you a Jew?" So it went away, but it wasn't because there was any particular logic why Mexicans are included, no matter what their racial background is, but Jews or Italians are not.
Yeah, no, there's been an official, and the Jews have largely, been on board with this, at least until the 60s or 70s, to not be classified as an ethnicity or a race. And the movie Gentleman's Agreement, and this is really, I know we're going off topic here, but Gentleman's Agreement, have you seen the movie from 19?
Yeah.
So, I mean, when the little kid asks his father, what is anti-Semitism? And this is 1946, 47. So, the shadow of the Holocaust is right there. And he starts explaining to him, and he said, well, that we go to the Protestant church over there, and then Catholics go to the Catholic church, and then Jews go to that synagogue over there. And so just as some people don't like Catholics, some people don't like Jews, right? They reduced us to just a religious denomination and nothing more. And this is right after the Holocaust, right? I mean, there's no acknowledgement that racialization, occurred and led to the death of 6 million Jews because they were a distinct race. And race is, as everyone knows, culturally constructed as it is. So it's interesting. It's really interesting. But we've gone off topic. We've neared the hour mark. So this has been a very fascinating discussion. So just to wrap up, Students for Justice in Palestine. Historians are not allowed to predict the future. Political scientists are. Maybe lawyers are allowed to as well. I don't know. What do you think their future is? And these campuses in particular, but in America in general, are they here to stay?
I don't know. We'll see. I mean, I think there's going to be there's certainly going to be efforts made to basically describe them as giving material support to terrorism, or if on a legal point of view and just on a political basis, just say they're a hate group, which ADL is already just came out with a big report essentially doing that, and how that lands is going to be interesting, and also kind of depends on, you know, it's not why, you know, again, I'm not out there to give SJP free advice, but I would tone down we want 1948 and we want and River to the Sea, and just stick with the free Palestine, because that doesn't, you know, who could be against freedom, right? And
But what about BLM Chicago putting out a meme saying "I stand with Palestine" and they have a Hamas paraglider in the image? I mean,
Or
right.
what happened to UCLA the other day with the beating of the Netanyahu pinata.
Right.
yeah,
Well, look, I mean, if it's not, you know, right now we're in the middle of the war, so it's hard to see the trees with this looming forest, but you know, this may be a fulcrum point in American culture that helps isolate the crazies. I mean, it's also possible this will be the time when the crazies become kind of even more mainstream than they were. But there does seem to be a revulsion among many people who are, you know, look, the far left, whether it be the crits or the SJP people, they're real enemies. They don't think of conservatives as being their enemies. They think conservatives are so out there, they're not even worth worrying about. What they want to do is overthrow the mainstream liberal establishment.
yeah, oh yeah, they hate liberals. The left,
Right, and the liberals have been like, you know, in a abusive domestic relationship with them. Oh yeah, they say they hate us, but you know, they're really good-hearted in the end, and they'll, you know, and all that, they'll stop. And you know, this may be the focal point where they finally say, you know, maybe we were wrong about that. Maybe these really shouldn't be our allies.
Yeah, one hopes, but I'm not sure I'm seeing that. I mean, if anything, there's a lot of the usual suspects in Jewish studies who are sort of keeping their mouth shut now. There's still a lot of very vocal ones who are, you know, screaming "Go, you know, Palestine" every day, but not the 300 who signed that statement in 2021, and not the thousands, or at least the segment that are Jewish studies professors who signed the elephant in the room statement. A large percentage are just staying quiet for the moment.
My prediction is that this current concern about SJP is just having a 15-minute of fame, and it'll probably die down at some point once this crisis in Israel is concluded, and we'll have relative calm restored, and these organizations will be active again on campuses until the next crisis. And this will just keep going on over and over and over.
Yeah, or they'll just come back under a different name. I mean, the movement's not
I
going to.
don't think that's going to happen. I don't think they're going to come back under a different name.
No, yeah, you're probably right. Look, at MIT, they refused to arrest some students who were, you know, engaged in, from what I understand, arrestable offenses because, quote, they're here on student visas and they were worried that they would get deported. I mean, wouldn't that be a good thing?
Right. Exactly.
We don't want felons, you know, in our country, or we don't want people who are here on student visas to be violating the law in a manner that threatens another minority.
Yeah, I mean, and I think they're inviting, given other things I've seen about pretty overt hostility to Jewish students at MIT, I would not want to be MIT's lawyer defending a lawsuit against them for hostile environment after they publicly declined to enforce their own rules against students who were blocking other students from attending classes in a way that was especially hostile to the Jewish students.
Yeah, that's absurd. It's like you're a foreigner, so you get some sort of special protection that people who are citizens don't get, which really boggles the mind. And I'm speaking to someone who was here on a green card for, you know, for a decade. So I'm a foreigner.
You're from Canada, right?
I'm from Canada. Yeah. So yeah, I know there were fewer obstacles for me than some people.
Well, no, I just the first thing I didn't think I'd do that, but as soon as the interview starts, like, I think he's from Canada.
Yeah, I've got a Montreal Jewish accent. That's my identity, Montreal Jew. Yeah.
Well, New York bagels are better.
No, not a chance. Montreal bagels are the greatest bagels in the world, and I wish I could get them here. It's very sad.
That's what I understand. Yeah.
Well, on that note, we've hit an hour, probably more than an hour. So we should finish up. This has been a really, really terrific discussion that's gone off in all sorts of directions. You know, all my legal knowledge until now really came from watching Law and Order. I've learned a few things about, you know, how conspiracy theories and material support works, and that's good.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah. This is us signing off and thanking David Bernstein, the second David Bernstein.
The second David Bernstein.
Yeah, we'll have to get the third one on at some point.
Yeah.
Yeah, the publisher. Yeah, he's the only one who hasn't been on yet.
Mhm.
And that's it. So thank you so much. And we will be seeing you again in a future episode.
Great, thanks.